When doing behavior modification, one of the important things that we do is we measure behavior and we record that behavior. But then at some point, we need to communicate what that recorded behavior means. We need to take a large amount of data, a large amount of numbers, and put those in a format that we can readily understand and other people can readily understand. Otherwise, our ability to do behavior modification will be severely limited. So how do we communicate that data in an understandable way? Well, that's what we're going to be covering today, because I'm Dr. Igor Yurichevich, and this is behavior modification. Let's go. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how to communicate the behavior that you have measured, how to communicate that data on behavior that you have collected. And we're going to be taking a look at a tool which is basically graphical displays of behavioral data. So to begin this off, we're going to turn to the single subject research strategies for behavioral change. And in this book, Parsonson and Bayer, they had a chapter, the analysis and presentation of graphic data, and they said that in essence, the function of the graph is to communicate in a readily assimilable and attractive manner descriptions and summaries of data that enable rapid and accurate analysis of the facts. So all of those words sound great, but what do they all mean when you put them together? Well, basically what they're saying is that you have a whole bunch of data that is too much for any one human mind to understand. So you need to put that data into a format that your human mind can understand, and very importantly, other human minds can understand, such as the person whose behavior you're trying to modify, the guardians of the person whose behavior you're trying to modify, other people that are involved in the behavior modification process. You need to be able to communicate this information, this data to them. So that is what we're going to be taking a look at today, those graphs and how do you understand those graphs, because we want to be able to communicate the information that we have collected, but we need to communicate this in a readily assimilable and attractive manner. Readily assimilable, so it's easy to understand. It's not a chore to get through and try to understand this data. An attractive manner, because let's face it, we're humans and we would rather look at something that is attractively presented to us rather than look at something that is unattractively. So always remember, in anything that you do, in any science that you apply to the real world, you are always dealing with real people. And real people have these biases in them. And the more you try to fight against them, the less effective you'll be. So humans like things that are easy to understand, and they like things that are attractive. So when we're communicating, let's make them readily assimilable, easy to understand, and let's make those communications attractive as well. We're going to put in these communications descriptions and summaries of data. So not the entire data set, but a summary of the data. And importantly, this is going to allow for rapid and accurate analysis of the facts. It's going to allow people to very quickly get a picture, an accurate picture of what is going on with the behavior of a particular individual. So let's take a look at a hypothetical example. Let's say that you were treating a client with autism and you were helping them develop fine motor skills. And one way that you were helping them develop fine motor skills was through puzzles. So you would want to measure their ability in completing these puzzles. And let's say that the behavior dimension that we're measuring is duration. How long does it take them to complete a particular puzzle? Well, you can collect data over a number of different sessions. So again, this is hypothetical data for a client named Kristen. And over 20 sessions, we recorded the duration that it took her to complete that puzzle in each session. And here are the numbers. And as you can imagine, looking at these numbers, it's very difficult to understand. Has there been a change in the behavior? What direction has the behavior changed in? How effective has our training and behavior modification been? So you can see that in that first session, 220 seconds was how long it took her to complete the puzzle. In that second session, she actually got worse, 267 seconds. That's longer. In that third session, still worse than the first session. So is this behavior modification working? Is she getting any better? Is it improving? Should we keep going with this treatment? It's very difficult to get that information in from a table of numbers, because that's not readily assimilable. And let's face it, as nice as this table is, it's not attractive. However, you put that same data into a graphical display where you have duration on that y-axis. So higher values on the y-axis mean longer durations, and you have sessions on that x-axis. And you can see very quickly that yes, she is improving. The duration is going down, and we should continue on with this treatment because it is improving her fine motor skills. So very easy to decipher that information to get a rapid and accurate analysis of the facts in a graph. Very difficult to do that with a table. And if you want some more purposes and benefits of graphical displays for behavioral data, I do have a previous video on that subject. Link is in the description. And while we're on the subject of line graphs, these are the most common graphical format that is in applied behavior analysis. So if you want to do behavior modification, it is essential that you learn how to use line graphs and how to read line graphs. And these will help us analyze some of the most important aspects of behavior, which is changes in level, trends in behavior, and the variability of behavior. And if you want a very quick overview of trend, level, and variability of behavior, I also have another video, how to do a visual analysis of behavioral data, link also in the description. So what we're going to focus on today is how exactly to read a graphical display of behavioral data, specifically a line graph. And to do this, we're going to go to a study by Ahern et al. And this was assessing and treating vocal stereotypy in children with autism. So vocal stereotypy, this refers to the repetitive non-functional vocalizations that individuals make. So these are vocalizations that do not serve a communicative purpose. So examples of this are things like repeating the same sound, such as e, or the same phrase, repeating somebody's phrase, humming, singing, making noises without any social intent, or just oftentimes scripting, which is repeating lines that they have heard before, oftentimes from a movie. So if the therapist here is asking this client a question such as, oh, can we try to do another puzzle? Stereotypy, vocal stereotypy would be evidenced if they replied with just e, or if they replied with a phrase that didn't make a communicative function, such as we're going to need a bigger boat, which makes you wonder, why is this child watching Jaws? But these are the examples of vocal stereotypy, these repetitive non-functional vocalizations that children on the autistic spectrum oftentimes have. So one of the treatments that you can do for vocal stereotypy, and the treatment that Ahern et al. Were investigating, is the response interruption and redirection behavioral intervention. And what this does is, when vocal stereotypy is occurring, the treatment is to interrupt the vocal stereotypy. So if they are constantly saying in response to questions, you're going to need a bigger boat, you're going to need a bigger boat, you interrupt that phrase, you interrupt the vocal stereotypy. You then redirect the individual to engage in appropriate behavior, either by answering a question or engaging a command. And you then reinforce the compliance with that appropriate behavior. So if they do answer the question correctly, you reinforce that. If they do follow a command, you reinforce that. So if you ask them, would you like to do another puzzle? And they start saying, you're going to need a bigger boat, you're going to need a bigger boat. You interrupt that. You say, here, let's start the puzzle. So you redirect them with a prompt, let's start the puzzle. And then you reinforce their behavior if they start the puzzle. And that is that response interruption and redirection treatment. So what they did in this study, what Ahern et al. Did in this study, is they looked at whether or not this treatment is effective in reducing vocal stereotypy. So we're going to use this as an example of how to read a graph and how to break down the pieces of a graph. And we're specifically going to take a look at Peter's performance here, at Peter's pattern of behavior during this treatment process. So let's zoom in there on Peter. And let's start off with breaking down each individual part of this graph so that we know how to analyze it, we know how to read it, we know the parts of the graph and how they all work together. So the first parts that we're going to take a look at are the horizontal axis. So that is the x-axis here. And typically that's going to represent time or some different value of an independent variable. Here we can see that it represents session. So it represents time as a function of how many sessions in was Peter for this treatment. And it's essential for tracking this behavior measurements across time. Oftentimes it's going to be in equal intervals for clarity. And you can also represent other independent variables on this x-axis, but most often it's going to be time. So here we have time on the x-axis, first session on the left, all the way to the 28th session there on the right. And then we also have the vertical axis, or that y-axis, and that is going to represent the dependent variable. So that is some quantifiable behavior dimension. This is your measurement of behavior. So again, we talked about measurement previously. So this is the number that you have assigned to a dimension of a particular behavior. And it typically starts at 0, but not always. And usually you're going to have an equal interval scale so that you can judge the change in behavior against a consistent scale. All right, so next we have, we just saw the axes. Now we also have the axes labels. So you label the x-axis, and usually this is some type of time. So in this case, it's labeled as session, and that's extremely important because now we know this is over sessions, not over days, not over hours, but this is actually in separate sessions. And then on the y-axis, we have percentage of vocal stereotypy in that session. So the higher the value, the more vocal stereotypy there was, the more repetitive phrases were uttered in that particular session. And if you need a brief explainer on how those percentages are calculated, I have a previous video on time sampling techniques and how you would calculate what percentage of a session vocal stereotypy occurred in. But for now, let's just understand that it's labeled as percentage of vocal stereotypy. And what that means, what that label tells us, is that higher values indicate more vocal stereotypy. So if we want to improve this person's behavior, we want to get to lower values. We want to get to lower values on that y-axis. All right, next aspect of this graph, we have condition change lines. So these are vertical lines that you'll see on the graph, and these indicate when an independent variable modification occurred. Basically, this indicates when a treatment modification has occurred, whether a treatment has begun or whether a treatment has ended. So here we have a condition change line indicating that a treatment, some aspect of a treatment has changed on session 7. Here we have another one on between session 14 and 15, indicating a change in treatment. And here we have a third one here indicating another change in treatment. Now, the lines indicate where the change in treatment occurred, but then you also have the condition labels. And the condition labels tell you what the treatment was. So here we have the condition label BL, and that stands for baseline. And this would be the phase where the treatment, where the vocal stereotypy was actually not treated. It was just measured, just to get an indication of how, what extent Peter engaged in vocal stereotypy, how big of an issue was this behavior. So that's the baseline phase. And then that first condition change line indicates when the baseline phase changed to the first treatment phase, that first response interrupt and redirect treatment phase. And then that becomes the current phase. And then the next condition change line indicates when that phase ends. And we go back in this case to a baseline phase again, where the vocal stereotypy is not being treated. And then we have one final condition change line indicating when the final treatment phase begins, and now we have response, interrupt, and redirect, once again, treating the vocal stereotypy. So those are the condition change lines. And we have the condition labels, and the condition labels indicate what the condition is. So we have conditions and we have phases. The condition is the environmental arrangement. It is the treatment phase that we're in, whether it's baseline or in this case, the response, interrupt, and redirect. So that is the condition. What is the environmental consequences and arrangement? And then we have the phase, and the phase is the period in the study that that condition is in effect for. So that first phase, which goes from the first trial to the 5th trial, that is the baseline phase. And then we have the response interrupt and redirect phase that follows that. So the response interrupt and redirect indicates what is the contingency, what is the environmental arrangement during that treatment period, and then the length of the period that is indicated by the phase. That is what the phase is. How long has that response interrupt and redirect taken place? All right, so next we have the data points. So this is one of the most basic features of it, but very important. So we have the data points, the actual points that are displayed on this graph. And each of these data points, so here we have one data point during the baseline phase. Here we have one data point during the response interrupt and redirect phase. Each of these data points tells us two things. First off, it tells us the measure of the target behavior. So how high, in this case, was the percentage of vocal stereotypy? How much vocal stereotypy occurred? And you can see that vocal stereotypy was much higher in that first data point in the baseline phase than it was in the second data point in that response interrupt and redirect phase. So it tells us how high the behavior was. It tells us the measure of that behavior, but then also it tells us the time and the condition that that behavior occurred in. Because we know that that first data point occurred in the baseline phase, because that's where it's located on the session x-axis. And we know that that second data point that I'm highlighting occurred in the treatment phase, that response interrupt and redirect phase. So data points tell us the measure of a target behavior, how much of that target behavior is occurring, and then it also tells us when that measurement is occurring. All right, and then we also have a data path. So once you have a number of data points together, you have a data path, and the data path is the connecting of successive data points with a line. And this gives us an indication of the level of a behavior and the trend of that behavior. So the level, how high on average is that behavior? And then the trend of the behavior, is that behavior going up or is that behavior going down? And then also we have how variable that behavior is. So that data path can tell us, is the behavior very variable where the line keeps going up and down, or is it very unvariable where the line is a lot flatter? So you can see that in that first baseline phase, we have a high level, we have a flat trend. It doesn't look like the behavior is going down at all. And we have a highly variable behavior. But if you take a look at the data path in that treatment phase, that response interrupt and redirect phase, we have a much lower level of the behavior. We have a downward trend where the behavior seems to be decreasing, and we have far less variability in the amount of vocal stereotypy for this behavior. And if you would like some more information on how to interpret levels, trends, and variability, once again, I do have that other video, how to do a visual analysis of behavioral data. Highly recommend check that out so that you become very fluent in being able to read those aspects off of a graph so that you can rapidly and accurately analyze those facts. All right, and then the last thing that we have on a figure on a graphical display of behavioral data, we actually don't have it on this zoomed in feature. We're going to have to zoom back out to see this one, and that is the figure caption. So the figure caption is that last piece of information, and that's going to be a concise statement that identifies the independent and dependent variables and explains any symbols, unplanned events, unique features of the graph. So we can see here in this caption, it reads that these graphs are the percentage of each session with stereotypic behavior for Mitch and Peter. So that tells us the dependent variable, percentage of each session with stereotypic behavior. And then the frequency of appropriate speech is depicted on the right. So that's the bottom one that we did not take a look at in detail. But again, it helps you to understand what is being shown in each of these different graphical displays. So once you have all those components, once you know about all those components, and once you become more familiar with reading all of those components of a graph, one of the things that it does is it allows you to very quickly decode a graph, very quickly and accurately, rapidly and accurately, and analyze those facts. It makes these graphs readily assimilable for you as a behavior modifier. So when you're taking a look at a graph, once you kind of know the aspects and practice with those a little bit, they become very simple to read, and you can get a lot of insight. And this is the important part, a lot of insight very, very quickly. So for example, let's switch now to Mitch. We're going to switch to Mitch. And so let's take a look at his graph here. And once you understand how to read a graph, and once you understand the pieces of a graph and how to decode them, you can very easily take a look at Mitch's record of his behavior. And we can very easily see that in the baseline phase, he had a high level of vocal stereotypy, but then that level was reduced in the response interrupt and redirect phase. And then there was a return to the high level of vocal stereotypy during the second baseline phase, which was then reduced in the final response interrupt and redirect phase. So we can get a very clear picture of how Mitch was responding to the treatment very quickly just by knowing how to read this particular graph. All right, so that is it for today. So today we took a look at graphical displays of behavior and what we're trying to accomplish with those displays of behavior, basically communicating in that readily assimilable and attractive manner, descriptions of data, summaries of data that enable that rapid and accurate analysis of the facts. And then we took a look at why it's important to be able to learn how to read a graph so that you can get that rapid assimilation. And then we ended with a look at Ahern et al.'s study on assessing and treating vocal stereotypy in children with autism. And we just broke down all the components of a line graph depicting behavior with the horizontal axis, the vertical axis, axis labels, condition change lines, condition labels that you know the condition and the phase, data points, data facts, data path, and then finally that figure caption. So that is it for today. Next time, we're going to go over the steps that you need to take before you interpret data in a graph. So I've now taught you how to interpret data in the graph, but next time I'm going to show you the steps that you need to take before you start interpreting that data. Basically, this is the steps you need to take to make sure that you don't get fooled by a pretty picture. But until then, I am Dr. Igor Yurichevich. This was Behavior Modification. Stay frosty, stay functional, and go modify some behavior. And you can amass a lot of data when you measure somebody's behavior.